Okay, I think we will get underway as it's 3 minutes past. So welcome to everybody. I'm Tom Brake, the Director of Unlocked Democracy. We're very fortunate this evening in having a very distinguished panel of speakers who are going to talk on the subject of multi-party politics in a two-party straitjacket. And our speakers tonight, I'm very pleased to say, are Rob Ford, Professor of Political Science from the University of Manchester and a Senior Fellow at the UK in a Changing Europe. We are also very fortunate to have Polly Mackenzie, who I know of old, who is the Chief Social Purpose Officer at the University of Arts London and former Director of Policy for Nick Clegg. And last but not least, of course, Polly Toynbee, political and social commentator for The Guardian and former BBC Social Affairs editor. What we're going to do now is we're going to hear from Rob on the subject of multi-party politics in a two-party straitjacket. Rob, over to you.
Thanks, Tom. So my brief here was to try and summarize about 60 or 70 years worth of change in the British party system in roughly 6 to 7 minutes. So I will have to paint with a very broad brush. I think that the big headline story here is we have an electoral system that is designed for a particular model of politics that has now completely ceased to be and has actually passed out of living in several stages. So in the early decades after the Second World War, we had what is close to a kind of Platonic ideal of a two-party system. Labour and the Conservatives were the top two parties almost everywhere, except for a few places where, for historical reasons, the Liberals were still strong, and each election was essentially rendering a verdict on the lot in charge and the lot not in charge. If you didn't like the lot in charge, you voted for the lot not in charge, and so forth. So you've got a basic two-party swing. Then starting from the 1970s, you see the emergence of third parties, the Liberals, the SNP, Plaid. So then you have a neither option, a none of the above option. 1974 is the first election in which we see both Labour and the Conservatives go down, and in a theme that repeats in all the period after that. Commentators who are used to thinking in binary two-party terms really struggled to make sense of this, that actually a big chunk of the electorate was saying, no, we don't want either of these options. Fast forward to 2010, obviously we then have various iterations of the third party. We have the SDP in 1983 and so on. Fast forward to 2010, 2015, and you have the emergence of two further parties on the ballot, UKIP and the Greens, and you have a record level of fragmentation in 2015. That then gets interrupted briefly by the process of Brexit, which really was squeezing politics into a different kind of binary straitjacket, leave or remain, and sort of paused the process of fragmentation. Then once Brexit got done, fragmentation returned with a vengeance. And in 2024, you had the most candidates ever, the highest level of fragmentation ever, the most disproportional election result ever, the most MPs elected on less than 35% of the vote ever, the largest swings ever, the largest radical right vote ever, the largest Green Party vote ever, and so on and so on. What you could see at every level and in every region of the country was a desire for multi-party politics channeled through a system that can't really adequately represent that desire, producing results that are manifestly, I've called it electoral chaos theory. You can't really predict what the electoral system is going to deliver when you have the electorate split into 4, 5, 6 or more differently sized pieces in every single seat, which is what we saw then. Since then, the development in the polling suggests that if we thought 2024 was a chaotic election, well, my goodness, we ain't seen nothing yet. We currently have three parties all polling evenly at around 25% of the vote in national opinion polling. We again have record Green shares. The Lib Dems are also up. if you try and plot that stuff out on a map, well, good luck to you. You won't be able to make a coherent story out of that. You've already got some of the braver opinion pollsters trying to produce new MRP models to make sense of what might happen. But, you know, if you tweak the assumptions even slightly, you get radically different results. Now, this is a problem, I think, for a couple of reasons. Firstly, the central justification for first past the post has always been that it delivers strong, accountable government. This is the argument you will still hear made by its defenders. What you get now is not, I mean, obviously we got a big majority on a small share of the vote last time, but what is the accountability structure here if the vote is fragmenting in 5 or 6 directions, and where what you get next as a government could be decided by tiny differences in how various different places vote locally based on their local conditions? And secondly, more and more voters are not getting the representation that they deserve in accordance with the shares of the vote that they're giving. One of the interesting things about the polling that we have right now, with a quarter voting for, saying they want to vote for a traditional right-wing party, a quarter saying they want to vote for a radical right-wing party, a quarter for the centre-left, and another quarter for various instances of the progressive left, is that that's actually what most European party systems look like in their current polling, in their recent elections. But in those countries, if you want a large centrist liberal party, you get a large centrist liberal party. If you want a large Green party, you get a large Green party, and so on and so on. Whereas here, our voters are not being put, the straitjacket analogy actually falls down here because voters have slipped out of the straitjacket. They're refusing to play ball. And the result is that a lot of the voters going into the polling booth are backing parties who then don't win, but end up helping to determine who does win, which isn't a straightforward or sensible way to link the governors and the governed, which is the whole point of a voting system. So, long story short, back when this was all about two parties, government and opposition, strong class politics, strong party identities, this system made a good deal of sense. Now we have a diverse country with a diverse range of political preferences and a very clear determination to express those preferences come what may. And the system simply doesn't work. The first past the post electoral system simply doesn't work as a mechanism for translating the popular will into government when that's the environment you're operating in. And even if those who currently govern us remain determined to retain that electoral system, the price they will pay for doing so is ever more chaotic and unpredictable election results. This isn't channeling politics into two centre ground parties, as the theorists said it would do. It's fragmenting politics and producing almost entirely unpredictable results.
Thank you very much, Rob, for I think predicting rightly chaos at the next general election. And we'll probably come on to some of the expected consequences of that. Just to remind people, do put any questions you want to put to our panel into the Q&A, and I should say bonsoir and boa tarde to the people joining us from France and Portugal. I would say good evening in Greek, but I don't know how to. Polly Mackenzie, over to you.
Thanks so much, Tom. Everyone should know that when I first started working for the Liberal Democrats in 2004, the team I was part of, called the Policy and Research Unit, had set up there were a whole bunch of sort of songs that had been written in sort of Glee Club style about the then shadow cabinet. And there was one sort of Vince Cable, ridicule is nothing to be scared of. And the one about Tom was, because Tom at the time was Shadow International Development Secretary, was what the world needs now is break, Tom, break. And every time I see you, Tom, which I've never told you before, I have that song as an earworm in my head. And I hope that what I've now done is polluted everybody's minds with that song. What the world needs now is proportional representation. No, break, Tom, break. You are a real kind of stalwart of campaigning on this issue and so many others. And it's really lovely to be here tonight, even if I'm going to regret it for weeks as this song routines in my head. So I worked for the Liberal Democrats for over a decade. And I'm interested in PR from just, when you've worked for the Lib Dems or for any kind of third party in a first past the post system, you can't help but have a sort of partisan interest in the complexity, the sort of grotesquerie of the results that you can get. I remember in 2010, obviously there were huge consequences to the ramifications of how the Lib Dems did in 2010, but fundamentally we got a lot more votes and we lost seats. And that was a very finely sort of tuned election. And I remember leaving Cowley Street, our headquarters at the time. There was going to be a meeting at like 9 p.m. to talk about sort of coalition and things like that. And I went and I met my husband in the pub at about 7 p.m., drank 2 glasses of wine and cried solidly for 2 hours at the perversity of this result, where we'd got more and less at the same time, and got into what the political academic Philip Cowley has described as no, the thought's gone out of my head, but essentially a forced move in Zugzwang, something that happens in chess where you've got to do something, but everything you do is essentially a pathway to what then happened in 2015, though we chose the path that involved serving in what I believe was a strong, stable and flawed but effective government, and certainly a lot better than what came after. And so I'm interested in it from that perspective, that, you know, as a liberal, as a Democrat, there's just something so frustrating when you are campaigning for things and it doesn't translate in the way that Rob's just described. But I think it's much worse than that, right? You don't have to be a Lib Dem to care about this. In fact, you might despise the Lib Dems and everything they stand for, and I still think you should care about this, because if you think about the last general election, where the Liberal Democrats did phenomenally well, right? Like better than ever before, better than under Charles Kennedy, but on an extraordinarily efficient share of the vote, by essentially doing really, really well in some areas and being almost wiped out or obliterated in other areas, as people kind of lent into sort of tactical voting. That creates a set of incentives for political parties, especially those smaller political parties, that I think are distorting to the quality of our national discourse and our national debate. You know, what happened to Liberal Democrats in the run-up to 2010 and in 2015 is that they became a party that were absolutely defined on the national stage, right? You could understand what the Liberal Democrats had done, believed in as a policy agenda. And the Liberal Democrat paid the price for that, as we know, in 2015. It is much harder to crystallise what Ed Davey stood for in the last general election, except for care, right? He really owned that agenda, and being just fun and normal and liking doing stunts. That's actually not enough, right, to be the government. And yet, because it sort of takes you out of the real political discourse, it actually allows you to kind of push further at the local level. And people who don't like the Liberal Democrats tend to criticise the party for being kind of, you know, Tories in one seat, Labour in another seat, basically Greens in another, and being pro-Brexit here and anti-Brexit there. And that is innate. I mean, it's not quite fair or right? Like, it's exaggerated enormously. But nevertheless, there's been proper studies kind of looking at the kind of the difference of messaging that's possible because the party is more invisible on the national stage, and it's incentivized by the entirety of our electoral model to do that. And I just think that undermines our ability to really have a politics which is about a battle of ideas and thinking and about the future of the country. And maybe it's naive and optimistic of me to imagine that you ever can have something that is so serious. You know, politics will always be partly a battle of charisma and a battle of budgets. But I feel really confident that first past the post, again, in this multi-party system, just creates distorted incentives on individual party behaviours to concentrate in individual places, to stay away from the spotlight almost, to not crystallise what they stand for in order to be able to behave differently in different places. And, you know, and of course, for voters, it creates the need, the pressure for tactical voting. When, as I was briefly, for a couple of years, Nick Clegg, speechwriter, and, you know, in the run up to the 2010 election, I remember the peroration was around, you know, don't believe those people who tell you it's only a two-party choice and you've got to just, you know, pick the least worst option, vote with your heart. We don't have an electoral system in which actually any leader can authentically say that to the voters and give them the best confidence that their vote will count. And, you know, what a stupid way to eat away at democracy.
Thank you very much, Polly. And the issue of distorted incentives, I think, is something that we're going to come back to in questions shortly. So thank you for your contribution. And I'd now like to ask Polly Toynbee to speak. Polly.
Hi. Well, Tom, you asked me to talk a little bit about history, as Rob has given a tremendous gallop through history, to take us back to what younger viewers here may not know much about, which was the SDP Liberal Alliance and the election of 1983. This was a moment of the biggest division probably in political parties, where on the Labour side, where on the Tory side, you had Mrs. Thatcher, most of those early 80s, in the most unpopular prime minister that ever been up until then, very high unemployment, a disastrous budget, disastrous cuts, and she was very unpopular. And on the other side, you had Michael Foot's Labour Party, very far to the left, and their longest suicide note in history, which is what their manifesto was called, was for pulling out of Europe and for pulling out of NATO. And that was Corbyn, Benn, and a whole lot of other people all for that. Well, they've more or less got what they wanted, haven't they? It seems, as where we are at the moment. But that was a time when there really seemed to be, it wasn't an opportunity, it was a necessity to have another formation in the middle, because most of the people in the country wouldn't have wanted either of those options. So the SDP was formed. It joined an alliance with what was then the Liberal Party, and after a lot of very painful, I wouldn't ask any other party to go through it again, dividing up of seats between them with much bloodshed on the floor in the process, reached the election and got. You know, we had done tremendously well. Shirley Williams had won the Crosby by-election, and we went over 50% in the polls, which was astonishing. And everybody was discussing he was going to be in the cabinet, which would have been more blood on the floor, I think. But the final result was that the alliance was only 0.4% behind Labour. Labour did very badly, but the alliance were only 0.4% behind. But because of first past the post, Labour got 148 seats and we got 13. And, you know, it was a very, very bitter result. Absolutely illustrated a time when people really wanted to break out of a two-party system of two extremes at their most extreme. Afterwards, perhaps as a sort of comfort to ourselves, there was a big move set about doing a big campaign to petition for electoral reform, and going from door to door all over the place. For quite, you know, I remember trudging from door to door. You realised at once that very few people understood how the present voting system worked, let alone what an alternative voting system might be like. They didn't really understand that they weren't voting directly for a prime minister, for instance. I mean, it's amazing the degree of ignorance that there was about how it all worked and who was responsible for what. I think that really has changed. I think people have become very much more aware of quite how grotesque the voting system is and how hard it is for people to express their own wishes. And they realise that holding your nose and voting for the least worst of big portmanteau parties is really unfair. Are you voting, if you're voting Labour, were you voting you know, for the sort of Corbynite, essentially anti-NATO, anti-Europe side, or were you voting for the Social Democrat side? And in the Tories who were anti-Brexit were treated outrageously, and they had no choice of saying, I'm the Heseltine Clark kind of Tory versus I'm the, extreme Michael Gove, Boris type Brexiter. And I think that it really has sunk in a way. I mean, I'd like to hear from you, Rob, whether you feel that that has changed, that people do understand it better and feel more indignant. I just want to raise one other thing that I was writing about this week. There was a big gerrymander done by the last government when they changed the voting system for mayors and for police and crime commissioners, which are recently new roles. We'll have a recently new voting system that was brought in with a supplementary vote, which was a sensible way to do it, where at least they had to win 50% of the vote by the time others had been eliminated, and got a reasonable amount of consent in that at least people could ensure the majority didn't get somebody they really didn't want, and was a fair system. But as the Tories sank in the polls, they at the last moment changed that system, gerrymandering it quite nakedly into an archaic first past the post system, and hoping that the result would be that because the Tories felt that they had many fewer second choices, that Lib Dems might be second choice for everybody, Tories would be second choice for nobody. And what's happening now is that new mayors are being instituted around the country for mayoral combined authorities. Every single part of the country will have one. And at the moment, Labour is pushing this through with big amalgamations, abolishing the districts, big amalgamations of the counties, and with a mayor elected in this unjust way, so that strings of towns will lose their voice. Places like Peterborough, Norwich subsumed into Norfolk and Suffolk, Brighton and Hove eaten up into Tory East and West Sussex, Exeter, Southampton, Reading, Oxford, Cambridge, all these anchor towns with the strongest identity in their area disappearing their district councils, and their elected mayor will be Tory or possibly Reform in everywhere south of the Midlands. There will be none at all. The number crunchers have been working at this. There will be no Labour or Lib Dem mayors anywhere south of the Midlands, purely because of the first past the post and gerrymandered system. There's still time to change this. It's all in progress. It's something very well worth campaigning for, to make sure that at the very least, as we lose our districts, maybe we can even fight to save some districts, we don't end up with a really distorted voting system.
Thank you very much, Polly-Ann, for flagging that as an issue. The analysis that we did was that the political benefit of the change to voting was even more pronounced in relation to police and crime commissioners, where it really did stop a number of Labour and Lib Dem police and crime commissioners getting elected simply as a result of that change, which went through without any consultation with the other political parties, which is normally, or should be, the norm in terms of electoral changes. Okay, well, thank you. I think we've had a bit of a history lesson from different parts of the sort of political field. What I wanted to do in terms of my first question, and I won't ask more than a couple, is just to ask you, moving things forward, what do you think the electoral landscape means in terms of what party strategies are going to be between now and the next general election? Is perhaps what Polly Mackenzie was talking about, which is parties really focusing on the local because that's the best way they can maximize support. Are we going to see that from all of the political parties? So I don't know who would like to kick off in response to that particular question.
I can give it a go, Tom. I think there are two difficulties in even answering the question. The first is because we're now in that zone in the polling where the electoral system has its biggest possible impacts. It's very hard to say with certainty what the right strategy is. To illustrate, there was one outlier poll that had Reform on 29 points, I think 4 points ahead of Labour on 25. If you apply a sort of naive uniform swing model, which you shouldn't, of course, but if you do, that would have Reform as the largest party in Parliament. If you have, by contrast, another poll that has Labour on 26 and Reform on 25, then Reform have about 30 seats and Labour probably have close to a majority. So that's a change in the preferences of a couple of percentage points in the public. It is a margin of error difference. It's a rounding error difference. It is not a meaningful difference in terms of the overall shape of public opinion. And yet you go from one parliament where Nigel Farage's MPs are the largest grouping to another in which they're not even the fourth largest grouping and Labour are close to a majority. So problem number one is when you've got an incredibly non-linear effect from the electoral system, it's really hard for the parties to even know what to focus on. And that's what the current polling looks like. Problem number two is the current mix of local battlegrounds is more diverse than it has ever been before. So every party has a reason to focus on different local circumstances, but that will pull them in all sorts of contradictory directions. You have an argument within Labour right now about what to do in response to Reform, but they seem not to want to talk about what to do in response to the Greens, who are actually the second place party in about 40 or 50 of their seats. You have an argument in the Conservative Party about what to do about Reform, but they are second place to the Liberal Democrats in about 65 to 70 seats. And there's really no route to a majority unless they address that. Reform themselves don't seem to know exactly what sort of seats they want to focus on or why. Whereas the smallest challenger parties, in a sense, this would be point number three, one of the weird paradoxes of the current moment is that the smallest parties who are most penalised by first past the post have the most obvious and clear electoral strategies to follow. It's really clear where the Liberal Democrats should focus all of their efforts. It's really clear where the Greens should. It's really clear where the SNP should. It's really clear where Plaid should. It's that big three parties all sat there on about 25% of the vote who really, it's not at all obvious what would be the right thing for them to do. And even if they do absolutely the right thing in party strategy terms, if the wind blows slightly differently, they could crash out and lose hundreds of MPs anyway, even though they haven't actually done much wrong. And again, that points to one of the fundamental problems with first past the post is we shouldn't be talking about one voter in 50 changing their minds and we go from triumph to disaster for any party. That doesn't make sense. But that's where we are. That is actually the sort of condition of public opinion that three big parties have to wake up and try and respond to. Wouldn't want to be a strategist for any of them, but it makes their job more difficult, but it also means that we can't properly answer the question of what does this all mean?
Thank you, Rob. You said you wouldn't want to be a strategist, but I am going to invite either Polly Mackenzie or Polly Toynbee to be a strategist in terms of how would they strategize for one or other of the parties in this sort of fragmented electoral landscape. What's the plan for winning the next election for one or other of the parties?
Sorry, you go, Polly.
I think Labour would make a bad mistake to feel that it has to plunge either way, either to blue Labour and, an identity that's designed for the red wall seats, or purely for the Green and Liberal Democrats. I think Labour has to say, we are the party for everybody. And I think that includes, and perhaps it's particularly easy at this moment where being the party for the nation at a time when we suddenly got to, defence has become a really serious issue, is a uniting factor. But on the whole, if you get your policies right, you don't need to weave one side to the other. And I don't think they need to take a plunge in either direction. But as Rob said, they've got to be jolly careful not to forget about the Greens and the Lib Dems with their 40 seats that they might well take off them. And perhaps they're not paying enough attention to them just at the moment.
Thank you, Polly Toynbee. What about you, Polly Mackenzie?
Well, there's one party that has a different set of challenges and opportunities than all the others, and it's the one that's in government, right? And that's such a different set of tools and tactics to use, namely trying to govern well, and I guess try and ensure that the country doesn't get pitched into a war and a trade war, and this is big level politics, which is really relatively different from the kind of how are we going to allocate our campaign resource area by area, place by place. The midpoint between those things are what is the demographic coalition that we are hunting to gather the support of, where does it fit geographically and demographically, which might then guide you into some of the decisions that you make. But fundamentally, the economy and public services need to be doing a bit better by the time of the next election for people to want to vote Labour, right? And it would be foolish, and I think that they're at risk of it, for them to forget that actually governing well is both their first duty and also the first call on their political strategy. Everybody else, I mean, you can't unfortunately get anything done. I think the Conservatives have an incredibly difficult challenge, and in trying to decide between two different pathways, essentially, and it seems clear that they are sort of cavalier almost about the threat that might exist from the Liberal Democrats. Consider it hilarious, the idea that they might consider Liberal Democrats to face any of their voters, and absolutely determined that the voters they need to chase are the ones who are voting for reform. But essentially what they're saying is we are just as radical as those people, but we can get elected. But of course, saying we can get elected is in fact a bit of a counter narrative to the fact about how radical they are. Plus they've got 14 years. I mean, that it seems to me that they're picking the wrong lane, but there is a danger of sort of Scylla and Charybdis closing in on them with reform and the Liberal Democrats, and they're the ones I think that could just go poof. Whereas Reform is a party that, for all the mathematical reasons Rob's explained, could either accelerate or just kind of like not really make any of the gains that they potentially could if they decide wrongly. For the Liberal Democrats, again, the strategic choice is obvious. I just think it's a bit depressing, and it's to hide away.
Thank you all. Now, I think because we've got so many questions in the Q&A, I should go straight to those. And I remind people, first of all, to put your question in the Q&A if you want to ask one, but also to put a tick beside other questions that people have already put down so that we can see which are the top choices. So at the moment, I think the top choice is a question from Sarah Vaughan, which is on the subject of PR. If we do get some form of PR leading to coalition governments, how long do you think it will take for our culture to change to one of cooperation and collaboration instead of tribal adversarial politics?
Well,
who would like to pick that up? Polly Toynbee.
I think that's very optimistic. I mean, you look at the Belgians, how long they took. They take 18 months to form a government out of a whole lot of different parties. I think the fact that you sit in a horseshoe shape helps. I think the fact that everybody knows that there are going to have to be coalitions, but they aren't easy to build in countries that have them all the time. I mean, Germany looks as if it's going to pull it off, but, not easily. And, it's, I I think the idea that, the lions and lambs are all going to lie down together once we get PR, probably not. People feel passionately about politics, including about politics of the centre as well.
I
Thank you,
agree with
Rob.
I agree with Polly on that. I think it's important not to expect too much of an electoral system or an electoral system reform. One way to answer this question is to say, well, what's happened in Scotland and Wales, where they now have a more proportional system, or what happened in New Zealand, which switched from first past the post to a proportional system? Did we get less tribal and adversarial politics? Well, I think if you ask the average person involved with Scottish Labour or the SNP, the answer would be an emphatic no. Ditto the Welsh parties, ditto the New Zealand parties. And as Polly's pointed out, this is true in many European countries that have PR for a long time. We have a lot of tribal and adversarial politics everywhere because people are tribal and adversarial, both people in politics and out of politics. You can't engineer that out of human nature with an electoral system. What PR does deliver is a fairer representation of the diversity of opinion that's out there and a better mechanism for negotiating a common solution across a broader spectrum of that opinion than a winner-takes-all non-linear first-past-the-post system. And there again, we can see evidence of that in practice, both in Europe and in places like New Zealand. You get more people in the room negotiating policy. On the whole, you will get better and more robust policy, and you'll definitely get a better representation of the spectrum opinion about what you should do. So I think don't expect a switch to a proportional system to deliver everybody sitting in a circle and being happy with each other. That's never going to happen. But what you will get is, a lot of argument, but probably a better outcome at the end.
I sort of
Polly
feel like
Mackenzie.
this feels like a weird sort of conversation that's like, if everyone had a unicorn in their house, how soon would it be before there wasn't any poverty? And you're like, well, the fundamental problem, right, is that the only people who can introduce a PR system are people who can win without a PR system. And it is possible, right, that we'll get to the point where genuinely all of the perversities that Rob has described and Polly's described and I've described, but that people have been pointing out for like really quite a long time, will lead to a crisis that can only be resolved by something that looks like a coalition. But, we had a hung parliament, we had a coalition, and okay, we didn't propose PR, we proposed AV, but the voters said, no, thank you, we'd rather have whatever incubators for babies or something. The problem is that it's very easy, well, not that easy to, and I don't want to be too depressing, but for communities of people like us who basically agree on this, to get together and assume that it's going to happen. I remember saying something along these lines at an event when I was running Demos, the think tank, at the Labour Party conference, and a woman came up to me and she said, you shouldn't be so gloomy. We've got a really worked out campaign for how we're going to get this to happen. And I said, oh, brilliant. And she said, the next step is we get the Labour Party to adopt it as policy. I'm like, oh, okay. And we've seen how well that has fared. It's like, it is still a bit, I'm afraid, free unicorns for every home.
Thank you, Polly. So I'm going to go on to another question, which has got lots of support, and that is from John Hack, and that is whether, if the parties get wise to this, instead of being tribal, would they not seek to gain votes by merging into alliances? So could we see the Conservatives and Reform simply merging?
No.
Perhaps some of the other parties on the left. Rob.
No is the short answer, and I'll explain why. It's again a mixture of human psychology and the way parties operate. So parties, I mean, the one honourable exception that Polly knows is the Liberal SDP alliance, but that was highly unusual. Parties don't tend to merge or form alliances because if they were prone to regarding themselves as being in the same party, they would be in the same party. One of the most persistent errors that people have made, for example, about Nigel Farage, is believing that he's just some sort of disgruntled conservative right-winger. The guy has been running against Conservatives since he was out of short trousers. He doesn't like the Conservatives. He doesn't want to be a Conservative. He's had ample opportunities to become a Conservative and spurned every single one. Similarly, anybody who's spoken in Labour events about the Lib Dems will find you get an awful lot of heckles raised, often more the Liberals, which they always insist on calling them, than you get sometimes in terms of the Conservatives. They dislike what they regard as the apostate much more than they dislike the heretic. This happens over and over again. These parties exist as separate entities for a reason. Their voters vote differently for a reason. Mergers and alliances won't work at the party level and also won't work at the voter level. I'll give you an example of that actually in practice. There was this Unite to Remain exercise in 2019 where the Greens, the Lib Dems, and who else? I forget. They all sort of stood down candidates in each other's seats. And we could have a look at then what happened. You know, if the merger thing works, then if you had 5% Green and 5% Lib Dem, you should get 10% because they should all come over. If it doesn't happen, you get maybe an extra 2% because most of those people don't want to vote for a Lib Dem that the Greens happen to quite like. They want to vote for a Green. So it doesn't work at the level of the party and it doesn't work at the level of the voter. So while it seems to make a kind of sense, and you can see why parties will often push for it. You see the Tory right pushing for it a lot with reform. You know, you'd have to want, the other side has to want to play ball. They don't. The voters have to want to play ball. They don't. So this is not going to end fragmentation.
Thank you, Rob. Polly Toynbee or Polly Mackenzie, can you see any mergers of parties in advance of the next general election?
Nope, I don't think so. I agree with all that Rob said. I mean, look at Reform. They can barely hold themselves together, let alone the Tories all over the place, let alone agree amongst themselves to merge with those others and then to pull it off. I mean, it was really difficult, despite the fact that the SDP and the Liberals, then the Liberals were not really that different. The bitterness between the two of them when it came to the processes of merging were really painful. It's not easy.
Thank you, Polly. Polly Mackenzie?
I think and that's true. It's funny, you know, I didn't start working for the Lib Dems until 2004, and I never really understood what the kind of the characteristics of the two sides were. But older hands, perhaps including you, Tom, would always tell me, "Oh, you can tell they're an SDP, like they're a Liberal, and it was still sort of, I don't know, you could still feel the joins in a way that absolutely affected people's behaviours. I just think, you know, people go into politics mostly driven by narratives of public service, right? And I think they're good people, but you only do it if you've got quite a bit of ego on you as well. And so if you are realistic enough to think, actually, yeah, what we need is a merger, you probably aren't in politics. They're arrogant enough to think that they'll be able to win.
Thank you. Another question, this time we've sort of touched on this, but I think it's worth focusing on it a bit more. And that is a question from Rick Gale, which is the constant hunt for swing voters in marginal constituencies under first past the post bound to create perverse incentives in terms of policy development? Polly Mackenzie, you sort of touched on this, I think, in relation to the Lib Dems.
Yes. I mean, having any kind of geographic location of MPs does this too, right? So, you know, people are always in favour of, I don't know, reduced defence spending, but like not in my constituents. I don't really want this tugboat. Or actually, yeah, we need to move to sustainable transport, but can you dual my road or whatever it is, you know, that and the sort of the natural kind of mechanisms of pork barrel politics, I'm afraid are reinforced by a constituency location at all. But the alternative is worse, I think, which is people who are just sort of disconnected really from the day-to-day realities of lives in a place. But you know, the fact that you can then narrow it down to that swing demographic in a very small number of places does create real challenges and perversities, and it means that we are not pursuing. The worst part of democracy, right, is that it's tyranny of the majority. But unfortunately, it's not even that. It is a sort of somehow a tyranny of a very specific targeted number of voters. I don't know. What have I added? Very little. This is just a group of people who all agree with the question, I think.
Well, Rob or Polly, would you like to agree with the question?
Yeah, I'll give 3 ways in which I agree with the question, actually. So here's 3 ways in which FPP skews the policy development process. Firstly, it overweights any interest that's locally concentrated against national interests, and this is what we see in terms of the disastrous inability that we have as a country to build anything, and a planning system that's completely balked. Because if you build houses anywhere, they have to be in the place where they're being built, and the people that live in that place won't like it, and they'll tell their MP about it. Whereas the people who get to move in and like it don't get a vote. Secondly, it skews the policy development process towards parties and interests that are geographically concentrated at the expense of parties and interests that are geographically dispersed. That always used to be at the Lib Dems' expense. It's now to their benefit. It's long been to the SNP's benefit that their vote is entirely concentrated in Scotland. So, you've got 4 or 5% Scottish nationalists get a representation in Westminster that a much larger number of voters for the Lib Dems or Reform could only dream of. And thirdly, which we saw very clearly with Labour in the last election, it skews the entire policy development process towards that slice of the electorate that has 2 characteristics: a willingness to switch and concentration in the seats that might change hands. The Labour's preference for no increases in taxation whatsoever in part does reflect a sort of fear, possibly irrational, certainly exaggerated, of the Conservative and press response to any tax increase, but it also reflects the fact that that is the preference of most of the voters who concentrate in those seats and are willing to shift. It is very different from the preference of the average Labour voter, let alone the average voter in a Labour seat. But it is the preference that ends up always winning in the policy development competition, because there is an incredibly strong incentive for the party to focus on exactly that kind of voter. And you make any kind of reform in the electoral system, and that incentive becomes much less intense than it is under our system.
Thank you, Rob. Polly Toynbee, would you like to come in on this question?
Yep, absolutely agree about the warping of policy in a big way, that this chasing after switches is a disaster. These are people who are not much interested in politics, don't, perhaps make up their minds to the last minute, and are likely to be very influenced by last minute tax bribes or tax fears, exactly as Rob has said. And it's produced a Labour Party that is tax phobic to a degree. I know they've just put up the taxes a lot, but that's frightened them so much that they're not going to do it again, despite the fact the only sensible way of paying for defence is to put up the taxes. And what better time when you've got a crisis?
Thank you. Sort of following on in some ways from that question, given the very tiny margins in UK politics that make the difference between winning and losing, do any of you feel that this opens the UK up to perhaps a greater risk of big money, foreign interference, and disinformation being able to swing elections, perhaps the next election, more easily than in a system where 1% extra for one party versus another wouldn't actually skew the results so heavily? So what's the risk of our system generating more interference perhaps than others?
So I think that is a correct analysis. But I think we're in an incredibly dark situation at the moment, which is that there is, the richest man in the world who has the capacity to put so much money into so many political systems that, frankly, you could influence any of them. And that is a protection that, again, that we've sort of decided, as the government has decided, not to intervene to prevent. When you've got somebody who could spend £1 billion influencing an election and not really notice, then you're in real trouble, right?
Rob or Polly, would you like to come in on the back of this? Are we more vulnerable because of the system that we've got and the very small margins that dictate winning or losing?
Yeah, Musk, as Polly said, Musk absolutely proves, if he can throw $1 billion here and $1 billion there and not notice, the game has changed. This is an opportunity where you have a government, a Labour government with a walloping great majority. It'll never have such a big majority again. Won unfairly because the system is unfair and distorted, that could say we are going to clean up politics, have no outside money in politics beyond small local small membership donations, and bring in a fair voting system, at least for one election. You can always say, we'll see how it goes, and if we like, we can have a vote about whether to keep it after one election. This would be the one opportunity for a real cleaning up of politics. And Labour could do it with a hand on their heart, saying, we've done really well out of this system, because usually the party in power, has done so well out of the distorted system that that's a reason not to do it.
Thank you. Rob, would you like to come in on this?
I mean, the only point I would, I agree with everything that both Pollys have said. The only point I would add is exactly the point you started with, Tom. When you're in a situation where a 1 or 2 percentage point difference in the vote can mean a difference of hundreds of seats, then that's exactly the kind of situation where money can wield a disproportionate influence. Because I'm a relative skeptic about the influence of big money in politics. I think voters' decisions are more complex than that, and even what we think of as big money is peanuts in the context of, for example, what big multinationals spend on their advertising budgets and so on. So I don't think it is mass determinative, but it is matters at the margins. And if the margins is where all the action is, then that's the situation in which you get a potential for malign influence.
Okay, I think we've got time for perhaps just 1 or 2 more questions. We had lots of questions on PR. And one of the questions from Brian Ratner was about can we make the campaign for electoral reform something that looks different from an appeal from perhaps the smaller parties to benefit them politically? How can we make this, perhaps the campaign for PR, something that the Conservative Party might want to support, for instance, or Conservative inclined voters might want to support?
The Conservative Party got pretty good reasons to want to support PR at the moment, because it might be the thing that saves them from extinction. So their reasons for wanting PR right now are not so different from Labour's reasons for wanting PR in the 1999 European Parliament elections. They'd much prefer 100 MPs to none. But on the broader point about partisan altruism, I think it would be a stretch to imagine that anybody's going to argue for this in purely altruistic terms. The parties that will benefit from it will want to point this out. I think a different way of framing the question is what is the most likely route to getting to electoral reform in this country? Practically every road to getting it from here in the next 10 years, as opposed to, say, the next 20 years, runs through the Labour Party. If you get the Labour Party on board with the idea of electoral reform, then there's an obvious coalition in favour of electoral reform. It's great if you can get the Conservatives on board too, or if the Conservatives are replaced by Reform have long said they're in favour of PR. So then you also have a major coalition. But paradoxically, you then have to sell the system in a way that's not just about any particular party's interest. And that's where you've got to come back to basic principles. Fair representation is one basic principle. Better policy outcomes is another basic principle. I think a third basic principle that resonates a lot more now, both because of the way things are going and the way people perceive it, is less chaos, less volatility. Don't you want a more predictable system? Don't you want a system that more reliably delivers something that reflects what you thought you were going to get? Because if we get a chaotic election result next time, you can be sure that will be an argument that's at the front of people's minds. So the argument needs to be non-partisan, but we can't expect partisans to be non-partisan, is one way of putting it.
Thank you. Would anyone like to dissent from Rob's view that we can sell this on the basis that it's simply fairer?
Yeah, I think we can, because it's there's such an outrage, mistrust, general disgust with politics now that something that looks like cleaning up politics, I think could fly.
Holly Mackenzie?
I don't know. I struggle with these conversations because I can't see sort of the game theory of how we ever make this change, but I would love to be proved wrong.
A Labour minority, Polly, that's what it starts with.
Yeah.
I'm
Pretty
going to
obvious what
try to
everyone else
squeeze
asks
in.
for.
I'm going to try to squeeze in one last question, and that would be, what would be the arrival of potentially hundreds of thousands of 16-year-olds and also millions of people suddenly on the electoral register as a result of automatic voter registration? Could you predict what might be the outcome in electoral terms of adding in those millions of extra voters?
Absolutely. If Labour went for it, it would be the opposite of gerrymandering. I mean, they were very in favour of it, put it in the manifesto, quite rightly, because at that point, those young people would have voted Labour. My guess is that next time, young people are on the whole disinclined to vote for the party in power, the establishment. Most of them by the next election will barely remember, certainly 16-year-olds, anything other than Labour in power. And they will vote for something else, whether it's Reform or Green or Lib Dems. So it's not, Labour would be doing it for all the right reasons, not because it would actually immediately now help. The right reasons being every single candidate will have to spend their time in schools and colleges instead of spending all their time in old people's homes. And instead of promising triple locks, will actually have to explain why they've taken money away from children, families, and education in order to pay for the old. And I think it would shift policy in quite a significant way.
Thank you. Rob or Polly?
Well, I may as well make the case for a much more radical proposal than votes at 16, which is votes from birth, probably held by proxy by the parents until at least the age of 10. Because it's interesting, you often get when those when people talk about votes at 16, people making exactly the case that Polly has made, that that children and families, 16-year-olds are sort of somehow supposed to represent all the children and the families in a way, but 30-year-olds aren't supposed to represent 25-year-olds because 25-year-olds get to vote for themselves. And there is something about that the distorted nature of essentially 11 million people at the bottom of the age spectrum not getting in any way numerically represented in the voting system, and I just think that is an argument that's made sometimes on the right as essentially extra votes for parents, but it is, and I think that it would in fact be the correct thing to do. But I also think it's important to make those principled arguments, rather than I think sometimes again people make a partisan argument for things like compulsory voting or compulsory or automatic voter registration on the assumption that these mysterious people who aren't voting or aren't registered or are too young to vote are probably on their side. And I think we don't really know that is true. We know that the Brexit referendum was in part powered by lots of people who hadn't really bothered with voting in a way that the sort of progressive alliance or the progressive fantasy would argue for. And again, lots of the arguments against first past the post come from people who might describe themselves as progressive or left, a belief that it's a way to sort of keep the Tories out forever. It might not be, actually, because it might be a way to more effectively represent voters including voters who would define themselves on the right, on the centre right. It might be that we disagree with those people and we might need to win the argument in different terms. I think there's very often associated with the assumption that the invisible people are on your side, and that's reckless.
Great. Thank you. And finally then, Rob, whose side do you think the invisible people would be on?
Well, I tend to agree with the second Polly, that actually everyone's assumption that the invisible people on their side is probably wrong. Actually, the invisible people, from what we know in the research, are pretty similar to the visible people. So I don't think enfranchising 16 and 17-year-olds makes much difference, because there's actually not that many of them in the grand scheme of things, and a lot of them won't vote. I don't think that AVR will make an awful lot of difference, because I think the people who aren't on the register aren't so different from the people who are. But I think both of them are right things to do on principle anyway, because everyone should have an opportunity to have a voice in the political system. The argument, as Polly M said, the argument shouldn't be a matter of partisanship, it should be a matter of principle. And I would add my own personal hobby horse to this, which is, if you want to give 16 and 17-year-olds the vote, great. If you want to give people who aren't on the register the vote, great. What's the largest group of adult citizens who currently don't have a say in the government that governs them? Long-term legally resident migrants with citizenship of another country. So if you want to further expand the franchise and you believe in the principle of expanding the franchise, you should be looking at channels for doing that, either by making citizenship cheaper and easier, or by thinking about the franchise for non-citizens. It's often forgotten that an awful lot of migrants who don't have British citizenship already get to vote in our elections because they're Commonwealth citizens. Nobody's had a problem with that. It's been the case since 1948. No one's had a problem with it. No one has ever stopped it. No one has ever reversed it. But my mum, who was from the Netherlands, never got the vote for 50 years while living here, while some of her colleagues working at the same hospital got the vote from the moment they arrived because they came from Jamaica or India. No one minded the second thing. No one will mind if my mum and people like her get the vote too, in my view, and I think they should. Family interest, I guess, but...
Well, it's good that we should conclude, Rob, on a policy proposal that Unlock Democracy supports, extending the right to vote not just to Commonwealth citizens, but other citizens who've been in the UK longer term. So on that, I would just like to thank Polly Toynbee, Polly Mackenzie and Rob Ford for their contributions. We could have run this for much longer, given the number of questions in the chat, but I hope everyone's enjoyed it. And we will, I'm sure, be organising other events soon, which you might want to attend. So thank you to our speakers and thank you to our audience for attending this evening. Thank you very much and good night.